Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, the mastermind of the October 7th, 2023 terrorist attack into Israel, is dead. The question is Hamas dead as well? To try and unpack this very, very important question, because a lot of people are talking about it in the Western media and in the Israeli media, that this is a potentially signal event that could change the situation of the course of the war. We have Rajan Menon, the professor emeritus of the City College of New York, and a fellow at Defense Priorities to try and help us unpack some of this. And we're going to talk about something you've written on this here in a little while. But first of all, just what is your off-the-cuff response when you first heard that Sinwar had been killed?
First of all, Danny, thank you for having me on. If I keep coming on like this, I'll have to buy stock in Danny Davis Deep Dive.
Well, money well spent, I would say. But
I'm not surprised that Sinwar was assassinated. I think the Israelis have waged a full court campaign, and he's been on the top of their list. They have enormous intelligence capabilities and military capabilities in Gaza, and they've put a lot of effort into catching him. It is odd, however, that from what we know, he was not killed because of an operation dedicated to killing him, but from Israeli reports, and this is all still a bit hazy, some trainees happened upon a building in which Sinwar was, and much to their surprise and his, there was a firefight in which he died. Nevertheless, they have confirmed through his DNA and dental records, he spent 20 years plus in an Israeli prison, so they know all about him, that he is in fact no longer alive.
do you have any sense for, and have you heard any reports at all for, is this just some weird thing where Sinwar came up, or has he been doing this all along and had never been caught?
I don't know. I mean, what we've been told, but again by the Israelis, that he's underground, hiding in tunnels, and they made him look like he's some kind of a rat and so on. Whether he came up above ground periodically, I don't know. I suspect, Danny, that in order to communicate periodically, he would have had to do that. But every time he did it, of course, it was a great risk. And my sense is he probably did it on very rare occasions. This was one of those occasions, and he paid the price.
He did indeed. The question's going to be is what comes next and what is the significance of this? And first of all, I want to take a look at Netanyahu, who predictably came out right afterwards to sound the victory term. Watch this.
I'm calling you, people of the region. We have a great opportunity to stop the axis of evil and create a different future, a future of peace, a future of prosperity in the entire region. Together, we can repel the curse and promote the blessing. Now it is clear to everyone, in Israel and in the world, why we insisted on not ending the war, why we did insist, in the face of all the pressures, to enter Rafah, the fortified stronghold of Hamas where Sinwar and many of the murderers hid.
So what do you make about that first comment right off the top, that this is a great opportunity to get rid of the axis of evil and achieve a lasting peace? Do you see any evidence of that?
Well, before I answer that question, Danny, let me make it clear, and you and I both agree on this, that what happened on October 7th was a terrible crime, probably a war crime, probably beyond that, a crime against humanity. But when I hear the Prime Minister Netanyahu, say, we have an opportunity now to create peace throughout the region. As we are having this conversation, Israeli settlements continue to be ramped up. Palestinian olive groves are uprooted. Palestinian sheep are stolen. Homes are demolished. In addition to settlement building that is ramped up, these so-called outposts are proliferating. Palestinian towns are under siege. And since 2007, Gaza has been under a blockade economically and in terms of the movement of people. So it's a little strange to hear him say that now that Sinwar is gone, we have an opportunity for peace. The facts on the ground in the West Bank, for example, show precisely the opposite, because a peace can only be had at the end of the day by reconciling Israel's need to live in peace with security alongside a solution that takes into account the Palestinian people's decades-long quest for self-determination, because they are not going anywhere, nor will they abandon that quest.
Yeah, well, there's certainly no evidence that anybody's ready to do that. As a matter of fact, it's interesting and noteworthy. I think that when you hear Netanyahu talking about this is an opportunity for peace, that apparently doesn't mean anything peace for the people of Palestine, because he said that they're going to continue fighting. Watch this.
Today we once again show the world the victory of good over evil. But the war, my dears, is not over yet. And it is difficult. And it exacts heavy prices from us. As King David said, I will pursue my enemies and destroy them, and I will not return to their end.
I mean, that sounds pretty apocalyptic. Not that they're
Yeah.
trying to defeat Hamas anymore, but I mean, just to defeat all of his enemies until they're all gone. What do you make of that reference to King David?
But here's the thing, Dan. He says it will extract a heavy price from us. Now, who is us? The price that has been paid for the war are 42,000 Palestinians dead. Beneath the rubble, there are many more. The death toll could reach as much as 100,000. Schools, museums, hospitals, universities, apartment buildings, sewage treatment plants, waterworks, these have all been destroyed. Proportionately, more destruction has been done to Gaza than to Germany in World War II, proportionately speaking. So to say that this will require more sacrifices from us is passing strange, in my opinion.
Well, it certainly does me as well. And Biden seems to be buying into this idea here, because he was in kind of a celebratory mood himself, and he also kind of listed this thought of opportunity is now opened up. Watch this.
Good day for the world. I call President now to congratulate him getting Sinwars. He had a lot of blood in his hands. American blood, Israeli blood, and others. And I told him that we were really pleased with his actions. And further that now's the time to move on. Move toward a ceasefire in Gaza. Ensure that we move in the direction that we're going to be in a position to make things better for the whole world. It's time for this war to end and bring these hostages home. And so that's what we're ready to do. That's what we're going to do. And I'm sending Tony Blinken to Israel. I guess he's going in 4 days. 4 or 5 days in, he's going. We're going to work out what is the day after now. How do we secure Gaza and move on? Thank you very much.
How do we secure Gaza and move on? I didn't hear much of a concern about the people who will be living in Gaza.
Precisely. Note that the president, rather like the prime minister, mentioned Israeli blood, which indeed has been shed, American blood, which indeed has been shed, but not a single mention of the blood of the people that has been shed the most over the past year, that is, the Palestinians. One other thing, Danny, it's very interesting, and this is a kind of peculiar American disease more than anywhere else I've seen, and that is to reduce politics to personalities. The idea is that because Sinwar is gone, Hamas as a movement that has been around since the early 2000s, right, will somehow all of a sudden make its way to the negotiating table and cut a deal on Bibi Netanyahu's terms, that is, Benjamin Netanyahu's terms. There's not a shred of evidence that it was just Sinwar. Hamas, whether one likes it or not, is a mass movement with a certain commitment, and it will continue to fight. So the idea that all of a sudden now we're going to have a ceasefire is, I think, completely absurd. And by the way, ceasefire talks have been going on for quite a long time, mediated by Qatar and the United States and others between Hamas and Israeli negotiators. And Netanyahu is the one who's been driving a hard line, in fact, scolding one of his mediators for being too soft in the negotiations. Now, I'm not saying that Hamas didn't have conditions of its own, but it's been a two-way street. So to say, well, the negotiations haven't led anywhere solely because of Sinwar is just absurd. The facts simply don't support such an assertion.
Yeah, and in fact, we're going to see the comment from at least the current leader of Hamas here in a second. But before I show you that, I think one of the reasons why some people may be thinking that this is an opportunity is because they have now taken out the leader. They had, of course, had assassinated Ismail Haniyeh prior to that in Tehran. And then, as John Kirby talked about today, the military capacity of Hamas, by any accounting, has just been devastating on the Hamas side. Watch this.
I've seen some statements out of them today, basically pledging to continue the conflict and continue the war. They are in such a dramatically weakened position. It's difficult to see from where we sit that they could perpetrate anything close to what they did on the 7th of October. But that doesn't mean that they aren't still lethal to some degree. And so we're going to have to watch that carefully. So two things. One, we're going to continue to support Israel with defensive capabilities, and that's not going to stop. Just because Mr. Sinwar's gone doesn't mean that we're going to in some way diminish our support to Israel and their defense capabilities. Two, as the president said last night to you all, this is an opportunity now to really step up and see what we can explore in terms of opportunities for a diplomatic solution and getting a ceasefire in place.
Interesting. I mean, no one could dispute the fact that, I mean, with that many bombs and the absolute devastated capacity that we see, that almost the shredding of the entire civil infrastructure, as you alluded to a second ago, within the Gaza Strip, that the capability of Hamas is not a fraction of what it was on October 7th. But is that the necessary for them to continue resisting Israeli occupation?
Right. So first of all, just a quick word, Danny, on Mr. Kirby's statement. Maybe I'm just not quite awake this morning yet, but I had a great deal of difficulty following his point. First, he says Hamas has completely lost the ability to continue. And then he says, but they're still lethal. Well, lethal means deadly. So which is it? And then he says, well, just because Mr. Sinwar is gone, that doesn't mean that things are dramatically different. And then he says, well, we have an opportunity now that we have to seize to create a ceasefire and beyond. So I'm not sure exactly what the administration has in mind, certainly based on what Mr. Kirby said, and certainly also based on what our president said. But your question was whether there's an opening now to move things forward?
Right. Yeah.
Well, to move things forward, you would at the very least have to have a commitment that addresses the needs of the Palestinian people, and that is for a Palestinian state. Now, the only way that I can see that happening is not through a binational state or a state in which Palestinians and Israelis all have equal rights from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, but some sort of two-state solution, right? Where the Palestinians have a state alongside an Israeli state. The problem is that it is this government in Israel that is hastening to undermine it through its settlements. Beyond that, let's be clear. Netanyahu has said, the Israeli Knesset, the parliament has said, a basic law passed by the parliament has said that there will be no Palestinian state. That has been said clearly. Now, remember that when the phrase "from the river to the sea" is uttered here in protest, it's immediately denounced as anti-Semitic, and it certainly is possible that some people mean it in an anti-Semitic way. But what is forgotten here is that the Israeli right has long used the phrase "from the river to the sea" to mean that within that space, only Jews have the right to exist. Nobody else has basic rights, and there will be Israeli sovereignty throughout that area, right? It's also even in the platform of Benjamin Netanyahu's party, the Likud. So I don't see how we get from where we are to any kind of peace unless it means an attempt to contain and suppress the Palestinians so that their grievances are kept in their heart but never acted upon, never spoken about. That is suppression, not accommodation. So.
Yeah. And in fact, whether a two-state solution, obviously that is not even on the horizon of any time frame that we can talk about here. But apparently, I think not unlike what Sinwar was saying, the new guy, I think his name is Naeem, he said that there's not going to be any ceasefire unless they get the complete withdrawal of all Israeli forces out. So apparently he does leave on the table the possibility of a ceasefire, but the condition that he has is probably just as impossible as the Israeli requirement that all the hostages be released first. So do you see any solution to this? And if not, what does that mean is going to happen next?
Right. So let's be clear that the Israelis and the Hamas negotiators both had their own conditions for peace, and they couldn't be conjoined, right? But it is not correct to say that Yahya Sinwar rejected a ceasefire. He said we can have a ceasefire providing all Israeli military forces are removed from the Gaza Strip, and that will set the stage for an agreement on the return of the hostages. So the idea that Sinwar was opposed to a ceasefire under any circumstances is wrong, as is the idea that his successors all of a sudden will be completely amenable to it because their back is against the wall and they have no choice but to do it. I mean, if John Kirby is right, and if Hamas has been defanged, well, why is it that they're still continuing to reject a ceasefire on Israel's terms?
Yeah, and I want to look at actually a little bit of that about Sinwar himself. We talk a lot about him, obviously he's been killed and stuff, and he was the leader. But I think that if you look a little bit at where he came from, I think it might provide a little bit more understanding of the condition that Gazans and other Palestinians view this as well. Now, I want to pull a few things here from an article you just wrote earlier today, I believe. There it is in the New Statesman. Sinwar's death won't save Gaza. Vengeance for 7 October is not the same as victory or peace, you said. And one of the interesting things you wrote at the beginning of this was that Sinwar was a prisoner of Israel for a long time and was released in 2011. I wonder if you can talk about how that even came to pass.
Sure. So very quickly, Gaza, as you know, and maybe many of the people who are listening know, has a disproportionate number of people who were displaced from places from which they had to flee once the State of Israel was created in 1948. Yahya Sinwar's own parents came from a village which is now near the Israeli coastal city on the Mediterranean. It's called Ashkelon, right? And Yahya Sinwar was born in Gaza. So he himself is a child of the displacement. He joined Hamas very, very early. He's a tough, uncompromising character. He spent 20 years in Israeli prisons. He contracted brain cancer when he was there. He survived. He learned Hebrew. He mobilized prisoners, Israeli Palestinian prisoners, kept them in the spirit of resistance, but also was ruthlessly punitive toward anyone who he thought was an informant. Now, how did he get out? In 2006, the Hamas abducted a young Israeli soldier called Gilad Shalit. One of the people who helped abduct him was Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother. And Mohammed Sinwar then was party to an agreement in which 1,000 Palestinian prisoners would be released in exchange for Shalit. But Mohammed Sinwar insisted that one of them be Yahya Sinwar. So had it not been for that deal, Yahya Sinwar would have never seen the light of day. He did say, by the way, Danny, when he came out, he said, I haven't left prison. I've just left one kind of prison and entered another. And what he meant by that is that Gaza since 2017 has been under physical blockade. People cannot go in and out of it very easily. And economic exchange with Gaza is closed off. The airspace is closed off and so on. So that is kind of the history of Sinwar. But we should understand that there are many people like him in the movement dedicated to what he himself is dedicated to. I don't frankly think that what he wants to do, that is to take back all of historic Palestinian land and for there to be no Israel, is feasible at all. And I think that's just a road to ruin and bloodshed, right? But I think to the extent that there needs to be a settlement based on accommodating Palestinian self-determination, I think that part is feasible, but it's not him that's making it infeasible. It's Israelis creating facts on the ground in the West Bank. Can I just say one other thing about Sinwar, Danny? You may know this, but it's worth repeating. Sinwar and Hamas are now being painted as if they were the devil. But for a long time, many people, including Bibi Netanyahu and people on to his right, viewed Sinwar and Hamas as an asset. Why? Because as long as Hamas controlled Gaza and the Palestinian Authority controlled the West Bank, there was a divided Palestinian opposition. The worry was that if the Palestinian Authority somehow were to win an election and come back to the West Bank, there would be talk again of a two-state solution, which would mean that Gaza would be on the table again. How is it that for years and years and years, Qatar has been funding Hamas? Do you think that would have happened without the wink and a nod from Israeli leaders like Bibi Netanyahu? I mean, you can. This is all fully documented, right? The Israeli far right has very often said it is a good thing that Hamas is there, providing we can keep them contained, because it makes the two-state solution much less likely to be on the table, and it splits the resistance movement. So it's a little kind of a bit of a revisionism now to hear Hamas vilified in the way that it is, because in part it is a creature of the Israeli right-wing forces.
Yeah, that's pretty ironic. Continuing on with your article here about Sinwar, you say that he was in some ways an obstacle to the ceasefire himself because of some of his requirements, and you alluded to this just a second ago, and that he was very ruthless. In it, you wrote the opposition leader Benny Gantz similarly said that Israel must continue operating Gaza for years to come. Sinwar's death seems more a staging post than a turning point, you wrote. Hamas is simultaneously a political party, a government, a terrorist movement wedded to the liberation of historic Palestine and the destruction of Israel. It is not a cult held together by one irreplaceable charismatic leader. I wonder if you can explain a little bit more what that means.
Sure. So Hamas is a political party. As you know, it came to power in 2006 after having won the Palestinian Legislative Council elections. The following year, it basically pushed the Palestinian Authority out from Gaza and took full control of Gaza. It's since then never held an election. Even the 2006 election, it won about 42% of the vote. So we have a situation where we have Hamas in power. Now, Sinwar himself has sometimes been a pragmatist. So at one stage, he said to the Palestinian Authority, when they began to discuss the two-state solution in the early 1990s, I don't object provisionally to the two-state solution that you guys are going to pursue, although I will never accept it. I am prepared for a long-term truce with Israel. But his fundamental bottom line has been that the state of Israel is a creation of British colonialism from the 1960s onward, because Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire. It came under British control, and the Zionist movement arose in the late 19th century, and the British allowed an influx of European Jews. And he views the entire Israeli Jewish presence in historic Palestine as a historical injustice that must be remedied. My own view is the state of Israel is there. You have to deal with it as a fact. But the fact that the state of Israel is there does not mean that it should have license to do whatever it wants to and whenever it wants to. The difficulty here is I don't see on the part of the Israeli government any strategy. So let's assume they defeat Hamas. Who will rule post-war Gaza? Will any Gazans, after what has happened, step forward to participate in Israeli-sponsored government? They would be dismissed as collaborators and quislings, and their life might be at risk, right? If that doesn't work out, is Israel going to annex part of the West Bank and let the other part just go and exist on its own? It would be complete chaos. Are they planning to militarily occupy the West Bank, which means that it's only a question of time before the resistance begins again? And who is going to reconstruct the West Bank? Hundreds of billions of dollars will be required for it because nothing is there. So other than fighting the war in Gaza, what is the end game here? What is the political goal? Because the Israeli national security establishment itself is split on the notion, which Netanyahu favors, that the goal should be to destroy Hamas. Some senior generals and intelligence people have come forward and have said that is not possible to do.
Yeah, militarily, it's not. That's one of the things we talk about a lot, which is one of the frustrations we have of even identifying what is the expected end state here. And one last thing I want to look at from your article here, Gary, if you could put that up, number 4 there. You says Hamas remaining leaders know that the very best they can expect if they wave the white flags are lifetime prison sentences from Israel. They have nothing to lose by continuing the fight, and like members of many Islamic resistance movement, don't fear death, but regard it as an honor. If that be the case, and if whoever rises to replace Sinwar leader of Hamas don't capitulate, then what is the next steps? What can we expect over the coming, let's say, 5 to 6 months?
I don't think this war is anywhere close to being finished. I think we're in for a lot more destruction. And unfortunately, the people who will suffer most are the civilians of Gaza, not Hamas, not even the IDF so much, but the people of Gaza, who are stalked by homelessness, by disease, by hunger, by famine. The place is a complete disaster. And especially for the lives of young children, it is horrible. So I don't see light at the end of the tunnel. And the notion now that a new chapter is open because of Sinwar's death, I think is simply preposterous. If that were true, I would be happy if it opened the road toward negotiations. But I can only go by the facts that I see, and I think you'll agree with me. There are very few facts that suggest that we ought to be wildly optimistic.
Well, wildly optimistic. I'd be happy with a marginal optimism at this point. But it seems to me, though, that from the Hamas perspective, if they wanted to say, "Hey, let's take advantage of Sinwar's absence. Let's elevate somebody else who has a clean slate in certain respects, at least at the leadership level," that say, "Okay, maybe we can make some accommodation. Maybe we can give some negotiation in your favor that he wasn't willing to give here." But that would still necessitate some sort of agreement from the Israeli side, that they would have to give something that they hadn't been willing to give before. And do you see any possibility at all that Israel will do anything except for just issue instructions?
Correct. So it's not clear to me that Bibi Netanyahu has ever talked about a permanent ceasefire. I think what he has in mind is a ceasefire that lasts long enough to bring the hostages back home, because within the Israeli public, the desire to bring the hostages, whether they're dead or alive, back home is a very pressing, urgent concern. Beyond that, I think he wants to retain in at least 2 places, in the Philadelphia corridor, which is a strip of land just near the Gaza Egyptian border, and in the Netzarim corridor, which roughly cuts Gaza in half, a military presence. Hamas has said that, yes, we can have a ceasefire, providing you pull the IDF completely out of Gaza. So there's no sense that any leader that comes after Sinwar will suddenly do a 180 and say, we're going to completely change our mind. We unconditionally accept a ceasefire. I can't see that happening.
And if that doesn't happen, then how will this war continue on? Because Israel has already gone from north to south throughout the strip. Now then they're starting back again in the north and just pummeling even more of the rubbled area. Where can the war go?
Well, my brother, I hate to get you even more depressed, but one of the things that we haven't talked about, you and I have talked about it offline, but what is happening in the West Bank, the building of settlements, the attacks by armed Jewish settlers on Palestinians, has made it more possible for Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. These are Islamist groups that are committed to violence and even terrorism. It has increased their strength there. And so now you have the IDF surrounding West Bank towns and engaging in airstrikes, anti-terrorist operations continually. So the West Bank, in a sense, is also aflame. So in a previous show, you talked about 7 fronts, right, that the Israelis are now fighting on. Well, there's a new front potentially, and that is the West Bank. And if that really gets out of control, how do we go from there to the peace and prosperity that Bibi Netanyahu wants, unless, of course, the Palestinians suddenly decide, well, we're going to stop resisting, we're going to accept our suffering and be quiet and let peace reign. That is not going to happen.
Well, that's Yeah, that's certainly not the narrative that's being tossed around in the West right now in this aftermath of Sinwars passing. One wonders and kind of imagines maybe a little bit sarcastically that a lot of these claims by the Western leaders, especially Biden and some of these others, is that they want to make it sound like some big accomplishment getting close to the election to make everybody happy and not pay attention to what's going on the ground there. But the bigger thing that could be in the offing is Gary, were you able to find that one by Biden that I had mentioned before about the Iran? Okay. Just before we came on the air here, I was on Fox News and they showed a clip of Biden apparently just moments ago was asked, do you know what Israel is going to do in its response to Iran? And do you know when it's going to happen? He said yes and yes. And then of course, they asked him when and what. And he said, I'm not going to tell you either one of those, then walked off, implying that something very soon is coming and that he knows what it is and apparently has signed off on it. So that could just take all of this that's been simmering into an absolute regional explosion. What do you think could happen? Let's just speculate for the moment that it's not going to be a nuclear stop, because that would be politically problematic for the U.S., or even the oil infrastructure, because that could be problematic for China, and we don't want to have them weigh into this. But it is something, say, on the military, something at IRGC, something like that, something that is very lethal, as the Israeli leaders have said earlier today. What do you see happening after that?
Right. So we'll take it in two parts, right? The first part, you are a strategist in your own right, and you know that in war, very many times, we do something thinking that we are conveying message A to the adversary, but the adversary is not receiving message A, but message B. Now, what do I mean by that? The belief seems to be on the American side and on the Israeli side that because of the pummeling of Gaza and now the killing of Sinwar, and because of the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and the ground operation into Lebanon at the expense of Hezbollah, right? Iran has gotten the message that it better be very, very careful. But is that the message that Iran has gotten? Because Hamas continues to fight, Hezbollah continues to fight. These are movements very closely linked to Iran. And if we are expecting that the Israelis will attack Iran and even keep, this I think is what Biden had in mind, energy infrastructure, nuclear infrastructure off limits. They can't, by the way, take out Israeli infrastructure because they need 35,000 ton bombs, which only 35,000 pound bombs, which only we have. And even if we gave it to them, as I mentioned in the last show, they don't have the bombers with the oomph to carry them, right? So I don't think they can do that. Oil infrastructure, there would be an immediate increase in American oil prices that would be attributed to Israel. And Israel imports 90% of its own oil. So what will they do? Probably go after some command and control posts, missile sites, IRGC headquarters, and so on and so forth. The expectation is that Iran will not do anything. Now we have a THAAD crew of about 100 people now deployed in Israel. If the Iranians fire back, I expect they'll fire back in a much greater number, hoping that some proportion, even if a small proportion, of their missiles will get through, and they will use their hypersonic ballistic missiles, right? Like the Fatah and Fatah 1 and the Khyber Shekan. Now, imagine a scenario, which is not a given, I think we talked about this last time, that one or more of our missile crew that are deployed in Israel are seriously hurt or, God forbid, killed. Does that increase the chances of our being pulled into the war? Absolutely. So we haven't seen the other shoe drop yet, right? That is the big enchilada, if I might, is what happens when the Israelis carry out a strike and Iran, as is expected, doesn't get the message and say, oh, we're now deterred, but decides, well, we're going to up the ante.
And they have certainly said that. Their Minister of Defense has reiterated that just the last few days, that there will be a much more painful and lethal response. So it's very similar to what the Israelis are saying now. So it might not be too much longer than we're not even talking about Sinwar or anybody else, because bigger things have overtaken it. But like all these things, we're going to wait and see what transpires. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking about right there. This is Foreign Minister. that something seriously as decisive would be coming in reverse. But we'll keep watching on this and report what happens. But before I let you go here, there's one other issue in the other major war that's going on, and that's the one between Russia and Ukraine. First of all, there was news that I think it was out this morning in the Kiev Independent, that Zelensky apparently told Trump when he was meeting with him last week that Ukraine will either join NATO or they'll pursue a nuclear weapon, to which very shortly thereafter, today, Putin replied back that, that ain't going to happen. And if we even think you're going to go in towards nukes, we'll take care of the situation. He was unspecific how he would do that. First of all, how do you see, or do you think there's any truth to that? Do you think that Zelensky actually would pursue getting nuclear weapons if he didn't get NATO invitation?
Right. Right after the Cold War, there are actually some Western strategists here. John Mearsheimer was one of them, who said the only way that Ukraine can assure its defense against Russia is to have nuclear weapons. But of course, they agreed as part of a larger arms control deal to have all of the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had deployed in what was then the Republic of Ukraine removed in exchange for an agreement by Russia and others that Ukraine's territorial sovereignty would be respected. As for NATO, when I talk to far-sighted people in Ukraine, I think they understand that NATO membership immediately is almost impossible, and even in the medium term is impossible for one simple reason. You need 100% agreement among all of NATO's, 32 members, I believe. So that's not going to happen because we know already that Hungary has said it won't approve it. Slovakia has said so. There may be some others. I'm not even sure, Danny, how supportive the Germans are. So I don't think that's in the cards. Zelensky continues to push it. I understand why he would like security guarantees. In his position, I would like security guarantees also. I think what will happen at the end of this year, a guess, so don't hold me to it, is that there will be some kind of deal in which Ukraine will have to provisionally accept, it may not legally recognize it, that Russia will hold on to some parts of its territory. Russia, I think, will push very hard for a neutral Ukraine. It probably will get it. And the Ukrainians then will have to fall back on something called armed neutrality. So if I were Ukrainian, the deal I would hold out for is, okay, you don't want us in NATO. You occupy certain territories that you're not willing to withdraw. By the way, Ukraine now occupies some Russian territory, but that's another story. We will then fall back on armed neutrality. What does that mean? We won't join NATO. We won't allow foreign troops or weapons on our base, on our territory, but we reserve the right to arm and train our soldiers from whichever countries we see fit. And that, of course, means the West. Already, the Western countries are investing in Ukraine's military industries, and supply chains are all going to lead west, and Ukraine is going to have in the future much less to do with Russia. I will say something that you may disagree with. I mean, I think Putin could end up winning this war but losing Ukraine, because every time I go back to Ukraine, the dominant sense there is that from now on, no matter how this war ends, they should have less and less to do with Russia in all forms, historically, politically, religiously, culturally. In that sense, it's a loss because Putin himself has said that there's no country more important to Russia from a historical, spiritual, cultural perspective than Ukraine. And that Ukraine is lost for him because it's a very big country. It's the largest country in land area in Europe, one of the largest in population. So even if it loses some territory, it's still a very big country. But I think we're a long way from knowing when the war will end and how the war will end. But there's no question that the Ukrainians militarily are on the back foot. The rainy season is about to stop there. The Russian offensive may slow down a bit. Ukraine has taken some territory in the Russian province of Kursk. Initially, the Russians didn't divert troops, but now they've had to divert troops not just from the southern parts of the front, that is Kherson and Zaporizhia, but also from Donetsk. And so you see a little bit of a slowing in Donetsk. But in terms of firepower and manpower, there's no question who has the greater punch. It's the Russians.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with what you said at all. And I think I'm certainly hopeful, no matter what reasons that are given, that this thing comes to an end quickly, just because I just hate people to keep dying for a war that really can't have any kind of a positive outcome. So I would be all for that if the sides could come to
Yeah.
some sort of
Let me
agreement.
just add, Danny, your viewers know this, but you've actually seen war, and people who've seen war tend not to like war. It's all very good for chicken hawks, sitting in some think tank somewhere in Washington, D.C., who've never got their hands dirty, to call for young boys in the United States to go and fight wars for which they don't have to pay, not only with their blood, but not even with their tax dollars, because we use the national credit card to fund our wars.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's why, General Eisenhower was, as president, hated war more than anybody because he had seen it. And I certainly despise war. I just can't tell you how much I hate it. And we use it too liberally here in our country. But we'll save that for another Daniel Davis deep dive. But in the meantime, thank you for coming on today, Raj, especially on short notice like this, on this breaking news about Sinwar. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Always good to be with you. My pleasure.
And we thank you guys too for joining us as always. Be sure and like and subscribe. We'll be coming up to you probably tomorrow with another one of the Intel briefs with whatever, the best of what happened during this week, and also, anything new that breaks overnight. So we'll look forward to giving you that later. And we've also got a really good week coming up for you next week. So thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.